Good afternoon. My name is Shuang, and I'm a CSPC program committee member. I just wanted to take the time to acknowledge that the CSPC conference is taking on the place of the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, and whose presence here reaches back time immemorial. We respect our traditional hosts and just wanted to thank them as well for allowing us to have this conference and to operate in this space and place. Next up, we have a really interactive panel focused on low carbon economy, which is organized by Queen's University. And as always, I'm sure you're tired of hearing this. Please don't forget to tweet us at Science Policy or #CSPC. And we really value your feedback if you take the time to fill the evaluation survey at the end. So without further ado, I'm just going to invite up Dr. Ross to start the start of the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So welcome to the session. The session's titled Critical Technologies, Essential Policies, Better Support for Canada's Low Carbon Economy. I'm Nancy Ross. I'm the Vice Principal at Queen's University. We have a very strong interest in advancing this area of study, and we're actively assembling our own expertise around the intersection between technological developments and public policy and social change. So I overstate the obvious often in this role, but it bears repeating. We face an existential threat of a climate that's too warm for life as we know it. And we are at the point where we do need a lot of technological change in carbon capture and storage. It's going to be required for us to meet this existential threat. But we're also going to require rapid social change at a pace that we're not used to. And in particular, we'll need to shorten the time between technological advancement and policy adoption. This conference is helping that move forward. So I urge conference goers to think about ways we can short circuit the time between our technological advances, their adoption in the economy, policy, and social change. So I'll get some specifics here to what you'll be hearing about over the next hour or so. So the panel will focus on what are the technological issues on reducing emissions and capturing emissions? What do we do with those captured emissions? And often an elephant in the room. And what kinds of behaviors will drive changes that lead to a low carbon future? So those are some of the specifics the panelists will get to. So a very exciting topic, very relevant, timely topic. I don't want to take up too much more time. I'm going to pass it right over now to Dr. Warren Mabey from Queen's University to lead off the discussion.
So thank you very much. I'm glad to see so many people here. We're really looking forward to having this conversation. We know that over the course of this meeting, there are any number of talks that are touching on different elements of climate policy and climate-related policies. We really wanted to dive into one area that I think we need to focus on as Canadians, and that is the issues around how do we manage carbon? How do we get it out of the atmosphere? How do we manage it so that we might be able to use some of it or all of it in useful applications? How do we incentivize companies that are wrestling with this change so that they can, make the changes that they'll need to make in order for us to reduce emissions and to meet the goals that are laid out in the Paris Agreement and in the ongoing discussions at COP and other meetings like that. Speaking of which, we know from the latest COP meeting that the goal of limiting our greenhouse gas emissions to the point that warming will stay within that 1.5 degrees Celsius range, it's becoming ever more fleeting as years go on and emissions continue to go up. What this tells us is, that not only do we need to make some changes to the way that we live and the way that we work, but we're going to have to use the very best technologies and the very best solutions that are available to us to actually start addressing those emissions and start addressing the amount of, our speakers are arriving, the amount of greenhouse gas, the amount of carbon that is out in the atmosphere. I'm really delighted to see everybody coming together. We had some timing issues that were going to cause us some problems, but it is all resolved right on time. You already heard my name. I'm Warren Mabey, and I'm a professor at Queen's University. I do a lot of work at the intersection of science and policy, and I'm going to be moderating this session. I'm going to take a moment to introduce each of our speakers. Working from my left or your right, Dr. Anna Harrison is a professor and a research scientist at the French National Scientific Research Center in Toulouse. We're delighted that she was able to cross the Atlantic to be with us today and to take part. She has expertise in carbon capture technologies that I think is really interesting and relevant to this conversation. Dr. Jewel Bergerson is an associate professor at the University of Calgary. Jewel has lots of experience in life cycle assessment and in assessing different energy systems, and can talk about how we measure progress and how we measure change as we work towards implementing these technologies. And then finally, and just arrived in the nick of time, Janet Ansley and Pat Carlson from Kiwetinohk Industries. I hope that I'm pronouncing this exactly the right way. I've been working on that. Pat is the Chief Executive Officer of Kiwetinohk. Janet is the Chief Sustainability Officer with that organization. And they're going to talk about some of the challenges of adopting these technologies and being a company, leading a company that is part of this energy transition. So critical parts of the conversation today. I'm going to kick us off with some slides. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this, but what we know about our emissions is really a story of challenge. You know, we've seen our emissions in Canada not only rise over the past 30 years, since 1990, since we really started paying attention to these things, but for the most part, not come down when we've instituted plans to try to bring those emissions down. So there have been any number of policies over the years, and there's a few of them on this slide, and lots of, very fun targets to try to bring our emissions down, but a real lack of progress and a lack of action on those greenhouse gas emissions. And there was a reason for this. If you go back and you reread those policies, which is something I encourage my students to do, many of those policies, while they were big on ambition, big on setting targets, big on, threatening some kind of punishment if we did not make some progress, they were short on solutions, short on alternatives, short on the things that companies and individuals needed in order to make those transitions in their day-to-day activities. And it's providing those solutions that we really wanted to talk about today. Our greenhouse gas emissions in 2020 were substantively lower than the year before, and you can break them down sort of like this. What you can take away from this graph, and again, I know it's too small and this room is too large for you to really pick up exactly what's on those slides, but roughly a quarter of our emissions in Canada are associated with oil and gas production. Not with the use, but with the production of oil and gas products. That's a very big challenge for us to face and a very big issue that we're going to have to overcome. Another quarter of our emissions have to do with the use of gasoline and diesel fuels and liquid fuels in transportation. So our transportation sector has a very, very large footprint. Other sectors, including electricity production and heating and cooling buildings and industry and agriculture, they each take up kind of a 10% slice, but these are major slices to deal with and require different policy solutions and a different range of alternatives to address. And it's worth remembering that the fact that we're at 672 megatons in 2020 is not really indicative of a downward trend. That was the first year of the pandemic. We were all in lockdown. Our emissions dropped substantively, but all the indications are that for 2021, they've bounced back. I don't know if they bounced back all the way to 2019 levels, which was about 730 megatons, but they're coming back up, and we're going to need to be addressing this in a hurry. The trend on emissions, if you exclude that last year's dip, would take us on track for something on the order of nothing apparently. It would take us on track for about 800 megatons by the year 2050. So 800 megatons by 2050. And that is using some of the population data that we have. We know that our population continues to grow. In fact, the government has recently come out with some very aggressive targets on immigration that are going to add to our population and are going to add, in turn to our emissions. We know that those emissions are not rising as fast as they could have, and the government is right to call that out and to highlight that, but we know that they're still going up. And addressing that and at least starting to bring them down is critical. That is why the government has put forward a suite of policies around net zero and net zero emissions. Most of these policies are in their infancy. They've come out in the last couple of years. We have not had good years of data to track their progress. So it is very hard to separate the impacts of a pandemic, the impacts of global recessions, and now global disruption with the war in Ukraine and the other geopolitical things that are going on from what is actually happening with our domestic emissions and the trends that are going there. So watching this and watching those policies over the next few years is critical. We have a couple of targets in mind. So we're now running out to 2050. That's the same curve, but I filled it all in just to highlight how important it is. We want to get to something like 40 to 45% below our 2005 level emissions by 2030. So within an 8-year time frame now. We want to get down to very close to zero, net zero, by 2050. And that means addressing that great big wedge of emissions moving forward. And there's a variety of different solutions. And one of the things that we do in my group is we actually model those solutions. And we look at, well, what could happen with different technologies? Where could we get to in terms of reducing emissions? And we eliminate coal and we address light transit through electrification of vehicles. We address heavy transport, mostly through the use of new liquid fuels or through electric solutions. We talk about overall electrification, so moving other energy uses away from combustibles towards electricity. And that is a good way for us to bring emissions down, but it's not going to get us all the way there. We talk about net zero buildings. And net zero buildings can take us a long way towards where we want to get to, but this is an incredibly expensive and difficult thing to do. We have millions of buildings across this country that would require retrofitting and would require very, very major investment. We can reduce those oil and gas production emissions, and that is critical. It's a quarter of our emissions now. It's going to be a quarter of the solution. Figuring out how to do that is going to be one of the most important steps that we can take. There are many people who would say, well, there's an easy way to stop those emissions. Just stop producing oil and gas, and then it's done. Is that realistic in our economy? Is that realistic going forward? Or do we need other technologies to start to address that and bring those emissions down? We can look at land use around agriculture and forestry, and I have a background in forestry, actually, so this is something that's near and dear to my heart. You may have seen recently that there have been several different analyses that suggest that the forest sector has a much bigger footprint in Canada than what they claim. It'll be interesting to see where that argument ends up, but what we do know is that the growth of trees, while it does take some carbon out of the atmosphere, it's not going to be enough to offset every emission that's out there, every emission that we need to deal with. And then finally, there's conservation, which needs to be a very big part of this solution. But what I want you to take away from this multi-layered sort of a graph is not, how are we going to get our heads around all of this, but rather that technology is going to play an incredibly important role, because conservation alone can't get us to the solutions that we need. Degrowth, ideas of just stopping certain sectors cannot get us to where we want to go. Our economy is too bound to our energy sector and too bound to what's going on to simply turn on a dime like that. We need to work with technologies in order to make the transition. So the key takeaway, shifting to a low carbon economy, yes, it can be done. It's not going to be cheap. Right now, we're estimating something like $3 trillion of investment in order to do some of this work that needs to be done. And that is probably an underestimation, because this is all based on technologies that have not been rolled out at a very large scale and that do not yet have the kind of proof, of operation that we need to see. But we're starting to get there. And it's going to have impacts on our economy that are not fully known yet or fully understood. Again, embracing the new technology options is going to help us to get there. Electrification is the biggest single contributor to making this transformation, but I would argue that carbon capture is going to be an essential part, particularly when you consider that we've loaded carbon into the atmosphere for decades, for centuries, really. We've put carbon out there that needs to be taken back. And figuring out technologies that can actually start bringing some of that back and utilizing it effectively is going to be critical. So what we want to know is, can we do better than net zero? Can we do better than the target that's currently being stated? Can we move towards technologies that are going to take us to that actually net negative future? And we're going to jump into that now. I'm going to ask Anna to take over the podium and to talk a bit about some of the technologies.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Warren said, what I'd like to do is give you a brief overview of some of the carbon dioxide removal technologies that exist and the potential role as well as the risks that come along with them if we are to implement them into a low carbon future. I'm going to focus more on the global scale, but of course these are relevant for Canada as well. So I'm sure we're all familiar, of course, with the context, but again, just to highlight the urgency of the situation, as Warren pointed out as well. So here we're looking at the greenhouse gas emissions annual on the y-axis versus year projected out to 2050. And the red line there shows where we're headed with currently implemented global policies. So with these currently implemented policies, it's very likely that we're going to miss the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So keeping the temperature rise below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, we're on target for more like a 3.2 degree rise. And where we want to be, ideally, is that light blue line, which hopefully you can see. So that's the 1.5 degree pathway. And what I want to point out there is how immediate those large scale emission reductions need to be to hit that pathway without a large overshoot. So what can we do to get there? Of course, there's the obvious, as Warren said already, it's emitting less. So moving to very low carbon or zero carbon energy sources, such as renewables, improving efficiencies and decreasing demand. But alongside that, we have technologies that can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from point sources directly, like out of flue gases. And we then take that carbon dioxide and we securely store it in another reservoir. So what exactly are carbon dioxide removal technologies, often referred to as CDR? So it's a group of activities or technologies that allow us to remove CO2 from the atmosphere directly, so right out of the air, not a point source, and securely store it in another reservoir. With the idea, these reservoirs can be biomass, they can be water, they can be soil, they can be the Earth's subsurface. The idea here is that we want them to store the carbon for thousands of years. So you may hear also of negative emissions technologies, or NETs, and so I'll be using that interchangeably with carbon dioxide or CDR technologies. So again, these are technologies that are removing CO2 directly out of the air. A little bit different than what you may have heard of, for example, in the panel this morning as well, which is conventional CCS, carbon capture and storage, where we can use technologies to remove CO2, sort of interrupt a point source stream and prevent it from getting into the atmosphere. But these negative emissions technologies are about capturing that dilute source, historic emissions, and things that are not coming from point sources and removing that from the air as well. So why might these technologies be needed? so there is a risk, of course, that if we focus only on technologies to remove CO2, that we don't focus enough on emitting or reducing our emissions in the first place. However, it's become increasingly likely that we will need these CDR technologies alongside drastic emissions reductions. So not an either or, but both, if we want to achieve these climate goals set out in the Paris Agreement. So importantly, we cannot rely on these technologies only and have them save us from these issues. We need to be doing drastic cuts to emissions and implementing these technologies, most likely. So just to demonstrate here in this figure, again, there's the CO2 emissions on the y-axis versus projections out to 2100. And that dark blue line shows the pathway that we'd want to take to remain below a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. And you can see that gray shaded region is the reduction in CO2 emitting technologies. So we need to reduce the use of those technologies. Alongside that, that big green slice is conventional abatement technologies. So that's moving away from fossil fuel emissions in the first place, as well as conventional CCS. And finally, at the bottom there, that blue slice is what helps us get to net negative, and that's our carbon dioxide removal negative emissions technologies. So in fact, in the most recent IPCC assessment report, they've suggested 3 roles that these carbon dioxide removal technologies might play in helping us reach these climate goals, and that is lowering the net CO2 emissions in the near term, and in the longer term, helping us to get to that net negative that we saw in that previous figure. And finally, they allow us to capture harder to abate emissions. So for things that might be harder to switch to zero carbon, like aviation fuels, for example. So what these carbon dioxide removal technologies are mainly trying to do is create or enhance sinks for carbon. So the Earth system has natural sinks for carbon that have helped to regulate CO2 concentrations over geologic timescales, and have also helped to mitigate to some extent the CO2 emissions from human activities already. So for example, in this figure here, we're seeing the CO2 concentration sort of pathway based on different sources and sinks between 1870 and 2014, where you see things like burning of fossil fuels, land use change, adds CO2 to the atmosphere, increases the concentration, but there are natural sinks, both on land and the oceans, that help remove that carbon and have reduced what we might otherwise have seen in terms of a CO2 concentration increase. And so the idea behind these carbon dioxide removal technologies is really to mimic or enhance these natural carbon sinks. So for example, there's some that are very nature-based solutions, so things like afforestation and reforestation, as well as coastal blue carbon, where we preserve or regenerate the ecosystems in the coasts that help to as natural carbon sinks. We have slightly more technologically enhanced natural solutions. So an example of this is what's called enhanced rock weathering, where what we do is we mimic the natural process of silicate rock weathering that happens on the continents that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and has done so over geologic time and helped to regulate Earth's climate over that time scale. But what we're trying to do now is accelerate those natural reactions, mainly by taking these natural rocks, pulverizing them to very high surface areas so they're more reactive, and then spreading them in places like soils where they can help bring CO2 out of the air. And then we have highly technological engineered strategies like bioenergy coupled with carbon capture and storage, where you capture the emissions from that bioenergy and you inject it into the subsurface where it's securely stored. And similarly, we have direct air capture techniques, which use chemical processes to suck carbon dioxide right out of the air. And again, you couple that with secure storage in the subsurface. So there are quite a number of negative emissions technologies that have been studied, but they have quite a wide variety of technological readiness levels. So for example, something like afforestation and reforestation is relatively well known. It's quite deployable already, where some are much more in the basic research or just beyond the basic research stages. Similarly, there's a wide range of capacities for CO2 removal, as well as a lot of uncertainty as to the global scale capacity that these strategies might have. which gives some uncertainty in how we might implement them. So for example, something like direct air capture has a very large potential capacity, but it's hindered at the moment largely by the fact that it's quite expensive to do. In this recent report coming from the US, from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, they've made an estimate of if we took all of these relatively well-known carbon dioxide removal strategies and scaled them up, that we could sort of safely and economically, and they defined economic at costing less than $100 per ton, that we could store significantly less than 10 gigatons of CO2 per year with these technologies as they currently were in 2019, which is not quite where we need to be to meet those climate goals. So there's definitely room for improvement, but there are a wide variety of these technologies that we can be working on. One of the important things to know before we go about scaling these up to the very large scales that they would be needed is that they all have different benefits and they all have different risks. And some of these are better known and some are less known. So for example, one of the benefits of direct air capture is that it's fairly high, it's quite high capacity and readiness level. It also has a very high storage security. So like I said, we want to be looking at least thousands of years of storage security of this CO2. And when we inject into the subsurface, the CO2 is quite stable and unlikely to be reversed. However, you do need energy input into this process, so you have to balance the energy input with the CO2 being removed. And at the moment, it is quite expensive. Something like afforestation, reforestation, on the other hand, is quite attractive. It's a natural process. If done well, it can do things like improve biodiversity. But if done poorly, at the very large scales potentially required, it can cause food security risks if it's competing for land uses, impacts on land use rights, and things like this. And it does, along with other nature-based solutions like coastal blue carbon, suffer itself from climate risk. So as climate changes and we have more wildfires, you have the risk of re-releasing that carbon, for example, or as sea level rises, losing that carbon that you may have stored in the coastal environments. So to wrap up here, I'll just take a slightly deeper look at these strategies that couple with CO2 storage in the subsurface. So when we store CO2 in the subsurface, there's sort of two main approaches. One is a more physical trapping, where you inject it in the subsurface and it's trapped by naturally occurring impermeable barriers. And another is a chemical process, where if you inject in the right kind of rocks, like basalts, like they're doing at the Carbfix project in Iceland, for example, the carbon dioxide actually reacts with that rock, forms a new rock, and stores the CO2 in a solid form where it's very, very secure. So the good thing about this is that it has thousands of gigatons of capacity for storage, but these reservoirs and the appropriate rocks are not everywhere. So again, it's not something that can be done everywhere around the world. But just as a quick example of some of the opportunities for these technologies is that some come with potential co-benefits that can be also explored in addition to removing CO2. So when we talk about making rock out of CO2, a process called carbonation, carbon mineralization, which occurs in the subsurface, we can also do this at Earth's surface using those same natural rocks or using waste products. So for example, the waste produced at certain mines, iron and steel making slag, as well as waste from concrete waste, cement kiln dust. These can also undergo the same chemical reactions and allow us to store CO2. So in some cases like this, there's opportunities for repurposing waste products, for example, to have a co-benefit with CO2 removal, which might help with implementation of some of these strategies. Okay, so that was a very brief overview of some of the main carbon dioxide removal technologies that exist. The main points being here that these carbon dioxide removal strategies are likely necessary to stabilize the climate to less than 2 degrees Celsius, and certainly for 1.5 degrees Celsius. There are a lot of technologies that are being investigated, which I suppose is a positive, but the challenge is that many of them are not ready to be scaled up, and there's a lot of questions of how to do this safely and sustainably. And importantly, there's not one single technology that's going to do everything for us. We need a big toolbox of both technologies and reduction of emissions on the other hand, and demand reduction to reach these climate goals. And also just leading in, I think, to a bit what Jewel will talk about next, there's the problem of verifying and quantifying how much CO2 you are removing with these types of things. Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Anna. And I think that what you should take away from that talk is a lot of hope. There are a lot of technologies out there and a lot of things that are working, but lots of unknowns, things that we need to be developing, things that we need to be pushing forward. How we actually make this transition is a really key question. And luckily, we've got Jewel here who's going to talk a bit about how we might be able to do that. So, Jewel.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Right, so verification and quantification sounds like an accounting process that's very dry and boring. I'm going to try to convince you that it's actually a really key area that we need to pay more attention to. And so talking about this path to net zero, actually paying attention to some of the details in the quantification of the role that these technologies could play can help us set the right path. And by right, I mean the most cost-effective way to achieve that net zero target. But also being able to show it. And I think that it's absolutely critical that we build a credible, transparent process by which we're actually communicating the changes we're making in order to get the society buy-in that this is worthwhile, this is actually making a difference, and that the investments that are being made are the right investments. So hopefully you're on board for that. So going back to Warren's slide where he was looking at the current trajectory and where we need to get to, and then these nice wedges of the role that each of the sectors that are carbon emitting will play to reduce that and achieve that target, sounds like a relatively smooth process, right? But I think the first piece is the slope of that line is absolutely unprecedented. So I have not seen a technology and infrastructure set that have been deployed at the pace that we're talking about deploying technology and infrastructure today, right? So I think we have to recognize that this is unprecedented in terms of the scale that we're talking about, right? The other piece is that if we segment each of the carbon emitting sectors of the economy and then look for solutions within that, we miss really important connections between these sectors. So we have a lot of interconnection within our energy system, and that actually is connected to the rest of the economy. And we need to take that into account to find the most cost-effective, most innovative solutions that are there, as well as to avoid some of the potential unintended consequences of creating the solution in one sector of the economy only to create new problems in other parts of the economy. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time in my research group. And so we focus on questions like this. Do we actually have a handle on what we're doing today? And we have national reporting guidelines that follow IPCC guidance in terms of how to quantify the emissions in each sector, right? But is that enough to help us ensure that we're getting the biggest bang for our investment dollar, right? Is it also inspiring the innovation that we require to make the best mitigation decisions at the lowest cost? Right? And then once we've actually got the plan in place to actually achieve the targets that we're setting, how do we convince society that we're actually on track to doing that and we're doing it in the most responsible way possible? And so to focus on the first question first, yes, we do have very robust reporting requirements at the national level, and that's what's used to actually look at those trajectories and historic paths of greenhouse gas emissions. But as I said, those connections between the economic sectors leads to potential uneconomic or not preferred scenarios of how we deploy these things if we do it at a sectoral level. And we create the opportunity for unintended consequences associated with that narrow view of the transition that we're looking at in each sector. The other piece I'll say is that variability within each of those. So we saw one wedge that was oil and gas emissions, right? If we treat that one wedge as a wedge by itself, as a monolith in terms of the activities that are occurring, we miss all the variability about the uniqueness of each application and therefore the technology options that we have available and the impact that they could have. The transparency and data quality is still an issue in many jurisdictions. So even what we're doing today, there is not enough data in the public domain to build credibility that we understand where those emissions are coming from and then can track below those to see where the mitigation is happening. So all of these have implications for the cost-effective mitigation. I'm just going to give you one example from our research that helps to demonstrate the type of variability in operations, as I said. So we had the one wedge of oil and gas emissions, right? A very tiny subsection of that is one particular technology that's deployed in the oil sands to extract oil in situ. So this is steam-assisted gravity drainage, where you're injecting steam into a well and then producing the bitumen to the surface in a parallel well. Right. So we've got 15 major projects that have been operating for quite some time. And so we actually went through and actually looked at the variation in greenhouse gas emissions per barrel of bitumen produced for each project over time, as well as to compare across the projects. And so the very tiny axis at the bottom there is greenhouse gas emissions in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel of undiluted bitumen that's produced. And so the best performing projects, and I don't think the laser's working, but the very top project there is the lowest emitting project that we have, which is on the order of 50 kilograms per barrel of bitumen produced. And that is that at the median, but you can see that there's variability within that project over the life of the project as it develops and expands and those kinds of things. The highest emitting project is threefold in terms of the emissions that it's emitting. Right? So that variability is something that you don't capture when you have a wedge of oil and gas being combined together. And it also has implications in terms of the technologies that we would want to think about deploying and the role that they could play in terms of affecting these emissions, right? So this is the kind of detail that we need to get into to understand that, right? We then need to think about the entire supply chain in which these operations that extract the bitumen then flow through to deliver the energy services into the economy. So I'll talk about that within the context of once we've actually looked at that variability, found technology solutions that we want to deploy in the unique context of each of these different these projects, then we need to start thinking about how do we actually measure that and demonstrate that mitigation. And so this is an example of a study that we did in 2020 that was looking at estimating greenhouse gas emissions for refineries around the world. So again, on the y-axis is the carbon intensity, the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel of crude that's processed in the refinery around the world. And then each of the slivers is a different refinery operating around the world. And so with that, then we can calculate a global average refining emissions intensity. And this was a paper published in Nature Climate Change in 2020. And I think most people are surprised when they see that. Haven't we already done this? Why is this novel and being published in a top journal? And it actually was the first time that we've actually been able to look at refinery level detail of the variation that we have in different refining operations around the world. And then we went on to say, okay, well, if you've got this footprint and this variability of different refining operations around the world, how do you think about mitigating and deploying technology to mitigate these greenhouse gas emissions? And so the green negative bar is the emissions you could achieve if you invested in the low-hanging fruit in terms of the emissions at the refinery and with technologies that are economic today. And then the purple is the emission reduction you could get if you actually looked for additional opportunities that might be higher cost, but that could actually give you a deeper decarbonization of the sector. Right. And so what you can see is that you get that variability in emissions currently and a different impact of deploying mitigation technologies depending on what jurisdiction you're operating in and what type of operation you have. Right. And so this is the kind of detail we need to get into. This is hypothetical applying technologies at sort of a high level systems analysis level. We need to start thinking about this in the regional context and the transitions that are occurring. This then again highlights the fact that our connections between the sectors of the economy are quite weak in terms of the data we have in the public domain. So the other part of this study was actually connecting the extraction of crude oil to refineries that actually process that crude oil to produce products that are sold in regional markets. This is the first time that those things had been connected to assess the carbon footprint associated with this. And so this is carbon intensity of refining. On the left-hand side, it's the producing nation that actually produces the crude. All of the connections in between are the refineries in which they get processed. And then on the right-hand side is the carbon intensity of the processing that occurs in the destination country. right? So again, to just reflect on the fact that these refineries don't sit in isolation, and so their mitigation can't sit in isolation as well. So choices you make to modify your refinery will affect upstream and downstream processes that could have pretty significant carbon implications. The last piece on this theme of refineries is that if we look at each individual sector in isolation, we sort of miss opportunities. And so this is a project we're working on that's called the Refinery of the Future, to look at some of the complexities of the sector and how it's connected to other sectors of the economy. And so in this very detailed figure, the dark blue box is the set of process units you see in a typical refinery today, right? Taking crude oil in, producing things like transportation fuels out. And you see a slate of different types of products, so gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other products. If you get a drop in demand of gasoline in a particular region because you've got high penetration of electric vehicles, that doesn't mean that that refinery will just slowly fade out of existence, right? Because they'll meet that demand, that declining demand, and then eventually just shut down. Because that refinery is also producing jet fuel, for example. And the decline in demand for gasoline and jet fuel are not coincident. So there's some complexity in terms of how do you continue to operate a refinery that needs to satisfy demand for things like jet fuel when you get changing demands for other products. And that creates opportunity. It also creates the potential for unintended consequences where you start doing things with the gasoline fraction that you might not have done from a climate perspective. So we've got a whole set of technologies that we're starting to look at that you might be able to pair with these existing sets of infrastructure that are sitting strategically close to demand centers that you might be able to make use of in a retrofitted capacity to deliver a new set of products, right? We want to make sure we're not getting technology lock into some of these things, but we also want to think more creatively about the solutions that we're looking for. And so just in conclusion then, I would say we have a good starting point on the existing system that we've got represented, but that another layer of detail would allow us to make better decisions, particularly in the public domain, where we really do need to have this conversation as a society and not just individual companies. And ignoring the variability and economic sector connections can really lead to, non-optimal decisions, both from a climate perspective as well as from an economy perspective. And so a credible, transparent, and systems perspective is really needed in this space to advance that dialogue. So with that, I will pass it along and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I think that this presentation does a great job of capturing some of the complexity that's involved in this transition. You know, nothing is really a linear, let's just take this out of production or out of operation, and that will lead to these types of emission reductions. Everything is very complex. And I'm glad we have people like Jewel that are looking into those interrelationships. We want to start talking a little bit about some of the policy retooling that's going to need to happen. And I'm going to ask Janet if she'd like to come up to the podium and speak to that. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janet Ansley. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer with Queetno Energy. And I won't say too much about Queetno because I don't want to scoop my boss that's going to speak right after me. But we are an energy transition company, and we're located in Calgary, Alberta. And I came to Queetno after working for a number of years at Husky Energy, which was a Canadian-based international integrated oil and gas company. So I really appreciated many of the comments you made, Jewel. They're bang on about when you're looking especially across borders and around integrated value chains. And what I also learned, Husky, by the way, that their little asphalt refinery in Saskatchewan had a little niche there where they were producing about 15% of the asphalt needs of North America. No Scope 3 emissions in asphalt. So there are differences, right? And differences in the barrel that you have also, a heavy barrel versus a light barrel, et cetera. So there's lots of complexities in the energy transition. Prior to that, I was Chief of Staff to Canada's Minister of Natural Resources and had the opportunity to work with this government in bringing in carbon pricing and working on a number of different projects that I think are still unfolding today. At Queetno, the reason why I'm at this company is because we're like a living laboratory for the energy transition. It's frustrating. I think the curves that Warren showed are frustrating to us all. How do we actually increase the amount of investment in low carbon and no carbon energy? How do we increase the investment in technology, drive the commercialization of this technology, and fundamentally transform our energy systems? Well, we need private capital to do that. But to date, the conditions just have not been right for private capital to do what it needs to do in order to really serve humanity. Keweenaw, Pat will tell you in a much better way than I the history of our name, that it means north in Cree, the most widely spoken Indigenous language in Canada. And we often begin our staff meetings and our investor presentations and others with land recognition. And being based in Alberta, we take a lot from the land. So I hope you recognize the traditional land where you're from, the traditional land we're here on today, as well as the land that we bring energy from in Alberta. And we're really committed as part of our being an energy transition company also to stakeholder capitalism. So we call it our prime directive. If there's any Star Trek fans here, our prime directive is to serve 8 stakeholder groups, including investors, but also governments, customers, vendors in our supply chains, the communities, and Indigenous nations. So when I think about policy, I'll leave it to Pat when he comes up. He'll talk about the specific activities of our company, our near-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. And what I see when I look at policy through my lens, and I also volunteer as a fellow with the Public Policy Forum to lead a lot of their electrification work and carbon management tables, is that we've got, the Canadian Climate Institute for Climate Choices broke it down really well. I wish I had thought about this in these terms. You have your safe bets, things you can do today that capital will be interested in investing in because they're low risk. They're low risk from a technology perspective, and they're low risk from an economic perspective. And then you got your wild cards. And those are the things in the future. And if we make a mistake sometimes in policy, I think it's that we keep hoping for the wild cards, the perfect solution, that science will deliver us the perfect solution, and that we will then have the moment to transform our energy systems. But so far that hasn't emerged, and I don't see many signs that one is anywhere near on the horizon, certainly within the time horizon that we've seen, 2030, 2035, 2050. So certainly by this report had some very interesting observations to make, and it's important that we look at these and we recognize these in our decarbonization challenges. Is that our safe bets by 2030 can help us achieve anywhere from 2/3 to 90% of our greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals. So that is technology that is commercially available today, much of which you've just heard about here on this stage. We have to do more, of course, to get to net zero 2050 and more to get to, of course, net negative. But we do have within our grasp, if we have the right policies, the ability to implement commercially available technology today. So when I look at the 5 principles, you need to have that widespread deployment of the safe bets. I think in some terms I hear that we have to do more every year between now and 2050 than we've ever done in the past in terms of capital deployment into the low and no low greenhouse gas emissions energy systems. So we need to be thinking about how do we actually just double down on many of these safe bets, that holding out for oftentimes perfection truly is the enemy of the good. And because greenhouse gas emissions don't get immediately, absorbed in our atmosphere, they're out there. We actually have to take these actions today, because if we delay, we'll actually have to do far more in the future. So I don't think, do the people get copies of these PowerPoint presentations if they wish, or it can make them available? Okay. Because I don't want to really stand up here necessarily and read you my slides. But, just suffice to say, I think that, we have to get things moving. We have to look at how do we provide fair and competitive marketplaces for technologies, looking at, in a very real world, how do we allow new market entrants like Queetno, or allow a company that's got a totally new technology the opportunity to compete in the market, that we're not, whether intentionally or unintentionally, favoring the incumbent participants in a market. And that's largely because the financial and economic system in business favors companies whose capital is already recovered, and facilities where those facilities have earned their capital back and that are fully depreciated. So how do you actually go in and make new investments? That's an additional hurdle companies like us have to get over. Jewel talked a little bit about the accounting. So we are not clear on our accounting systems quite yet. In different provinces in Canada, we have different greenhouse gas emissions regulations. In Alberta, we've got a system called TIER. Other provinces have theirs. We've got our federal backstop program. And there's no real universal way of accounting for emissions to decide what is the most important type of greenhouse gas emission to be reducing, whether that's scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. And ultimately, we do hear a lot about net zero goals, but they really only apply to the scope 1 type of emission, while the scope 3 emissions are also causing climate change, and ultimately we need to get to them. And we need to have a way that continues to provide certainty around policies. Being from Alberta, we often fear that we're getting left behind, and that causes political reaction in our communities where people fear change. I personally think there's more opportunity for Alberta in the energy transition than there is risk, and we need to look at the systems on how we can kind of get on with it. But for many, there is that fear. So we need to have the ways of counting not only the emissions that we saw on the chart, but also the opportunities around CCUS. If we can lock and geologically sequester carbon emissions underground, we need to have the measurement, monitoring, and verification processes where we can properly earn credits. And earn credits not just in Alberta to be used as offsets against emissions, but ultimately credits in Canada, that if we can sell natural gas or other products, oil products, into the Ontario market, for example, and those products actually have lower emissions than what would be imported from the United States or another country, then we need to get recognized for that. So we have to have accepted, standardized emissions credits and emissions trading markets in order to make these things happen. And long term, you have to lock these prices in. We can't be at the whim of having a government change and have a policy or a regulation, whether it might be small, and change the treatment. I think everyone is a taxpayer. You'd file your own individual taxes, and the treatments change from year to year. On a corporate level, this is just all the more complex. And sometimes the difference is a make or break for a facility. I look at the treatment of ethanol. Husky was also a big producer of ethanol biofuels in Canada. And on the other side, you can actually have incredible markets created and opportunities created for Canadian companies around things like low carbon fuel standards. If we can have the certainty as a business community that those markets will be there in the future, we will invest. So to tell you a little bit about what Queetno is doing, I will hand it off to Pat, but I very much look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Janet. And our last speaker in the panel is Pat Carlson, who is the founder and CEO of Queetno. And we look forward to hearing about somebody who's actually trying to do this work that we're all talking about. So Pat, lovely to have you here. Thank you.
So that slide should look familiar. Janet and I work together. I think we're kind of unique in our scope of business. We're an oil and gas company that's making electricity and hydrogen. We're in the early stages. We're 5 years old. And we're using solar and wind as well as oil and gas. And I'll get a little bit into that. This is the same Indigenous acknowledgement. It's important to us as part of the accepting of our name, it's important for us to convey and to actually implement measures that help our Indigenous people recover some of the hurt that they've suffered over the centuries. This is, the colors aren't standing out very, very brightly, but you can see on the left-hand side, it's red, in the middle it's yellow, and on the right is green. Those are stoplight colors, essentially indicating we have to go from doing the things that are in red through doing the things that are in yellow to do the things that are in green. And there's three levels. There's the primary energy sources, and there's the energy transfer vectors, and there's the energy uses. And that's important because we often get confused about the energy transition, and we think it's just a matter of where the energy comes from. We don't really take into account how we use it. And you know, when you have your strawberries from Mexico in February, you're eating have a high carbon footprint strawberry. And I think we do that without thinking about it, but it's going to affect, the energy transition has to affect every aspect of our lives, how much energy we consume, and we have to think about ways that we can have a comfortable lifestyle without doing the things that have high carbon footprints. And so we have to measure the carbon footprint of everything in our day-to-day lives to understand what's impacting it. Part of what will help that is carbon taxes. When things are taxed, the price goes up, then we'll be less inclined to do them. And so we're an oil and gas company and one side of our business, and we big believers in the carbon tax. However, as I had a discussion with an Alberta politician at one time, and the discussion went, I think we should have a higher carbon tax, I said, and she said, yes, but we can't really get out of phase with the United States because our economy is so dependent on the U.S. So I've spent a day talking to people in the government about increasing the carbon tax and how carbon tax is important. It's important for all of us to accept that if we're going to accomplish this in the free market, or private enterprise, private investment capital is going to be part of it, then there has to be direction from the people to the government to implement the carbon taxes and a fiscal environment where it makes investment possible towards some of the things that were talked about by the previous panelists. Investor money doesn't go after a situation that's not for profit. So investors pursue profit, so profitability and sustainability are two sides of the same coin in the long term in the economy. And I can't invest my shareholders' money in things that don't make money. So we have to think about that in terms of all three levels there: energy uses, energy transfer vectors, and energy sources. As to energy sources, as I said, I think we're using wind and solar. We don't have any wind project yet. We haven't found one. We have up to 4 solar projects that we're working on assembling, and 3 of them are in the Alberta Electrical System Operators queue for approval. And we're augmenting, because wind and solar are not reliable and dispatchable. The wind doesn't blow all the time. The sun goes behind clouds and sets at night. We need something that makes up for that, and there's battery technology isn't there yet to get Alberta through a cold week in January with no wind. So we need natural gas, and so natural gas fired power. But we can add carbon capture and sequestration to that, and we can do that. Alberta is blessed, and I keep referring to Alberta because it's our scope. That's where we operate, but this applies to other jurisdictions as well. Alberta has a lot of carbon sequestration capacity in pore space in sedimentary rocks. So our targeted 10-year vision for the company is generating 1.5 gigawatts of electricity, which is targeted by one independent evaluator, estimates that Alberta's market will be 15 gigawatts. So we're targeting to be 10% or more. This is the 10-year targets that we put out when we IPO'd. We didn't IPO, we listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange in January 14th without an IPO. We want to consolidate and develop 300 million cubic feet per day of gas production. That's not a big gas company, it's a medium-sized gas company. And we want to become a significant producer in the emerging hydrogen business. So how big we are in electricity and how big we are in hydrogen depends on how that difference evolves. They're both clean energy vectors. So if I go back to the last slide, you can see in the middle there that the energy transfer vectors, how to move energy from place to place. We can move energy, if it's clean energy, without emitting CO2 by having electricity or hydrogen. And so that's one way we can solve that problem. So we want to become a significant producer in hydrogen business, and we want to capture greater than 90% of the carbon dioxide associated with our gas-fired power and blue hydrogen businesses. And that's our 10-year goal. I think that we're kind of unique in that there's oil and gas companies, and there's midstream companies that do carbon capture and sequestration, and there's power generators, but there's nobody else other than one possible company in the U.S. that at least our investment bankers tell us we're unique in that. And what it does is it makes us, in terms of our scope, the scope 3 emissions that would be there for an oil and gas company become scope 1 emissions for us. I'm concerned that the oil and gas markets that we rely on will vanish as small users of oil and gas are unable to afford carbon capture and sequestration because of the scale of their operations, and so they cease to be oil and gas customers. And so I think there's going to be a fundamental transformation in the markets for oil and gas, and there will become, particularly for natural gas, there will become another business in the middle that converts gas to hydrogen and to electricity. So where are we today? We're about 16,000 BOEs per day equivalent. You count 6,000 cubic feet of gas as 1 barrel equivalent. And so we're roughly 50-50, so something like 50 million cubic feet a day of gas and 8,000 barrels a day of natural gas liquids. We have 2150 megawatts across 7 electrical power projects in the Alberta Electrical System Operator queue for approval. So there's 7, and then those are at stage 2 or further. We have others that are being contemplated that are not that far along in the approval process. As you can imagine, with the energy transition, the approval process is bogged down, and it's taking years now to get projects approved. So what's involved is you do the front-end engineering and design, you do the environmental evaluation, you make the environmental applications, you make the application to the regulator, you need to secure grid capacity, and the grid has to be built out to accommodate the project. So there's a lot of steps that are needed, and we're not in control of all of them. We're just in control of this broader scope than other oil companies have. And then we've assembled the team skills to do all of that business, so we can initiate projects in anywhere. One thing I didn't mention is that we're trying to tie co-located businesses to our power and hydrogen production operations, so that the co-located businesses can use our carbon capture and sequestration services. We can provide them with gas, hydrogen, electricity, and we can build hubs that reduce the emissions for all of us. This is our power portfolio strategy. I said earlier that we're looking for clean, reliable, dispatchable, affordable natural gas or electricity, clean, reliable, dispatchable, affordable electricity. And the thing about renewables, wind and solar in particular, is they're very clean and they're affordable, but they're not reliable and dispatchable. You can't count on the day being sunny in terms of reliability, and you can't flick a switch and turn up the sun. So what we need is natural gas to back that up. And so in combination with the natural gas-fired power, with carbon capture and sequestration, we can have clean, and we can have reliable, and we can have dispatchable, and we can have affordable, although the cost has to be higher because we're essentially putting in a redundant system. The solar and wind, although they're the preferred way, are the redundancy. The natural gas could supply all the power we need by itself. So some interesting emerging commercial thoughts. These are things that we work on. Again, we can't finance things unless they're proven or they're a small part of a bigger project that we're financing. So higher rate, higher capacity electricity storage. And that's at two scales. It's mobile, like you'd have in a car or a train, and I recognize a car and a train would be substantially different, but in a lot of ways similar. You're looking for hours worth of storage capacity, not days, not weeks. And so you're looking at smaller outputs, whereas a grid capacity, you want to make up for something like a gas-fired power plant. And a gas-fired power plant, we're looking at our smallest one is 100 megawatts. So 100 megawatts for a week would be the fixed grid scale challenge, and the mobile one would be, everybody's heard of getting more than 300 kilometers or more than 500 kilometers, especially in the Canadian climate where we use a lot of the energy for warming the vehicle and the batteries are less efficient. Lower cost, clean routes from methane to electricity. We'd like to go lower cost post-combustion carbon capture. We're contemplating post-combustion carbon capture on our projects, but we've also looked at oxy-fuel generation, which is the alum cycle in particular that we're looking at. Integrated autothermal reforming with hydrogen-powered zero-emissions peaking plant, so we could have an electrical plant that's reciprocating engines, runs on hydrogen, and we could take the hydrogen from a hydrogen manufacturing process, efficient one, capture the carbon and sequester the carbon. So more efficient decomposition of methane to hydrogen yielding valuable forms of carbon such as graphite and graphene. And earlier speakers have talked about sequestering carbon dioxide in volcanic rocks, and that's what much of British Columbia would require, whereas we in Alberta have sedimentary rocks and we can store the carbon dioxide in pore space. In British Columbia, much of the area, like the Vancouver area, would probably rely on basalt, which is an emerging technology that it's so emerging or so submergent yet at this stage that I didn't include it, although not meaning to diss that technology at all. I just was trying to get the ones that are near that we're looking at and monitoring to see when they get to be technology readiness level 9, we can pounce on them. More efficient, and lower cost, more efficient, impurities tolerant hydrolysis. And that's another way to have a larger solar array field. And you just use the extra power to manufacture hydrogen from water. But the problem with Alberta is we get the sun, and because we get the sun, we don't get the rain. And because we don't get the rain, we don't have the water. And because we don't have the water, electrolysis doesn't work unless you go to deep fossil water. Deep fossil water has salts in it, and so that's the challenge there. So summary is we need to act urgently and decisively on the things that we can profitably do right now. Janet touched on that. As a policy decision, waiting on the big eureka, hey, we found it, this cures the climate change problem, it's over, energy transition is finished. That doesn't make sense to us. We should do all we can do now. The floods and droughts that British Columbia has next door to us that have been devastating and costly don't consume the carbon dioxide that's causing them. The carbon dioxide's still in the atmosphere, and in fact more. Somebody mentioned forest fires release more CO2 into the atmosphere, and the situation just gets progressively worse, and eventually we run the risk of it sort of becoming a cycle on its own, out of control, and no longer driven by human emissions of CO2, but by the systems itself. So this is an urgent thing for humanity, and we need to work together at a policy level so that science can do what it can do and industry can do what it can do. So you can see the other things there. I won't read them all to you because I think most of it has been talked about already by other speakers. So that essentially concludes my comments for you.
Thank you very much, Pat. And it's amazing to see what a business that chooses to take this direction can do. You know, I find that the model that we see kind of employed here, it's doing a lot of the things that we've been talking about for years. It's combining different energy technologies. It's combining different policy solutions in order to actually affect a change. I'm conscious of time, and I know that there are going to be some questions from the floor, so I would invite people that want to ask questions of the panel to come up. We do have a microphone at the front, and if you would like to come and pose some questions, we'd be more than happy to start to take them. So please.
Hello. Thank you. That was a great panel. So my name is Abhishek. I'm a CSPC volunteer and I have a background in petroleum, so I definitely appreciated this. So my first question is for Anna. I think you mentioned a lot about, reservoirs for carbon, and some of them are, using carbon back in the economy. So, I mean, if at all we are using it back in the economy, there's the chances of the carbon being re-released to the atmosphere, maybe by cutting trees or by some other method. So what are your thoughts on that? That's question number one. And question number two is for the entire panel. So right now, I mean, recently in the US, there were some important bills that were passed that made basically decarbonization a little more, encouraging for them. Do you feel the need for a similar bill in Canada? And what do you think would be the most important policies that should be covered in that? So those are my questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. So Anna, do you want to start? And the microphone should work. There should be a...
All right. Is it? Yes? Okay.
I think we're good. Yep.
All right. Thank you for the question. It's a very good point that there are also options of creating products out of CO2 that's captured in what's known as carbon capture and utilization instead. But there is the risk there, as you pointed out, that if the longevity of the carbon that's in that product isn't long enough, then it's not really doing anything in terms of emissions reductions effectively enough. So we are looking at, you need things really that have a storage for thousands of years to really have the effect on being negative emissions. And so with some of those strategies, there is more of a risk of reversal, that it won't be for long enough. But I wouldn't say, like, for example, for reforestation, just because there's a risk that there's forest fires and it's re-released, that it's not worth pursuing. Because certainly if it's done in many places at large scale, then some of those will be longer term, others will be shorter term. But it's not a risk that means we shouldn't pursue it at all, in my opinion. And I guess sort of relatedly, there's also sometimes options that products that you make from captured CO2 could replace other materials that we currently use. So there's some maybe embodied carbon savings there. I think maybe Joel could also speak to that. For example, construction materials that could be replaced using mineralized CO2. Yes.
Yeah, just on the mineralization, I think we need to look for opportunities to make use of CO2 in productive ways. So mineralizing and using converted CO2 for construction materials seems to be some low-hanging fruit, just because of the magnitude of construction materials that we're consuming and will expect to continue to use into the future. But there's a whole slate of technologies that we might use captured carbon for. All of them are thermodynamically challenged. So there's going to be costs and there's going to be energy implications associated with those. So again, I think you really need to have the smart decision making associated with those as you go forward. Maybe I can jump to your second question about the incentives in the US that have been created. There's a lot of enthusiasm right now about the IRA, as well as the 45Q that was announced a few years back in the US. And I think some of the attraction to that is that they are carrots rather than sticks. So the carbon pricing being the stick, these are, tax credits and things like that. And why aren't we doing that in Canada, right? I think, it would be nice to think about just taking a US policy and applying it in Canada. We have a very different system. We've got a patchwork of regulations in place right now. I think it's unrealistic to think that we're going to abandon those to a fully new system. But I definitely think there are some real opportunities in the way that the US has structured that we should be able to borrow some of that. And I think that the carrot side, I think, is really interesting, particularly because of the challenges that, yes, any economist in the room, the carbon price that's economy-wide is the most efficient way to get emission reductions. We see struggles with that everywhere, right? And getting to the price that we need in order to actually see the action that we need. And so I'm now of the mind that we need to look at, suboptimal, but maybe more effective policies. And so I think some of the work in the US provides some really interesting examples for that.
Janet or Pat, do you want to comment on policy question?
Yeah, I think just to pick up on the conversation about policy, the carbon price is a great start, but it is definitely more of a stick than a carrot right now. In fact, we were having the conversation in our team today that when you are banks won't essentially give you any credit for any emissions credits that you're generating. And because a lot of the emissions credit systems are kind of designed to go away, for example, as the clean electricity regulation takes hold and we bring down the carbon intensity of the grid to 2035, on our solar projects, we actually get fewer offset credits from the government because we're not, of course, avoiding the same amount of emissions as we were 5 years ago through solar because the actual grid is cleaner. Yes, the carbon price has gone up, but the number of credits you receive has gone down. So ways that we can start to, though, flip that around and have opportunities where we do have those credits is, and on things like CCUS, how do you actually, because that's an engineered solution, have a methodology and certainty at the federal level, but also in the provincial policies about what you're going to get on those credits. And then if governments can make those credits bankable by giving you, and then they talked about this in the fall fiscal update about giving, having the Canada Growth Fund do some work in order to actually have sort of contracts for difference. So if the contracted or if the carbon price was supposed to be $100 and through policy it's either 0 or maybe it's 50, that the federal government has backstopped that carbon price so that you can, if you've got credits, you can sell them for a version of that price. It might not be 100% of the forecasted carbon price, but at least you've locked it in and you can provide certainty to your project economics of having some kind of value. So we kind of have to put our money where our mouth is and, we've done a lot on regulation. And then it's also looking at how we can be more, I guess, consistent in some of the principles. We have chosen to return, I know as consumers, we all pay the carbon tax, but in some cases, particularly in Alberta, we got to recycle some of those carbon taxes that industry pays back into the technologies that we've been talking about today. Not kind of putting them into general revenues or, spreading them out in their way. We actually have to put that money back into solutions. And maybe there's some more efficient ways also to be doing that. Pat, anything to add?
Not really. I think we just need to keep in mind that climate change is a global problem requiring global solutions, and making one country or one part of an economy uncompetitive when there's not cooperation, at least among the leading financial nations like the G7. If there isn't that kind of cooperation, it's very difficult for one country to make an impact. But I think leadership is required, and the U.S. is doing that with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Thanks for that. I'm aware that we're getting our yellow card, and that means that we're going to be asked to close down in a couple minutes. What I want to ask is each of the people that are queued, I think there's 4 people queued, can you pose your question? And then we'll ask the panelists just to respond kind of in block. Thanks.
2 things. I've been pondering your comment about the unprecedented need for the pace of technological change. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded in wartime, World War II, 1940, the pace at which frigates and planes were ramped up and built. And then much more recently, the pace with which Apple diffuses new cell phones, but they're able to cannibalize their previous generation of cell phones. So I worry in the oil and gas sector, for example, the players who would be the cannibalized are not the same as who the cannibals would be. So one point. And then for Janet, I think it was, I saw your list of the things that are the sure bets as opposed to the wild cards, and notwithstanding the difference between carrots and sticks and that sort of stuff, what would the carbon price, assuming we could figure out the equivalent from an incentive point of view, a carrot point of view rather than a stick point of view, what would it have to be in order to make all of those things economic so that the banks would be comfortable financing those investments?
Okay, thanks for that. So keep that in mind. Your question, please.
Johan Saint-Onge, Canadian Space Agency. I'm interested in the cost effectiveness and the economics in the intangible economic perspective in terms of like investment in green infrastructure with the increasing engagement, participation, inspiration, legitimacy. For instance, like in the space agency, we invest in astronauts, and then poof, and inspire a bunch of people to get into STEM. If we invest in low-hanging fruits in terms of green technology, like how much, if was there a study that was made that it brings like this or that type of engagement within population, and something like that.
Thank you for that. And then one more. Yep.
So Janet, you mentioned how there's a little bit of a fear of not having as much oil and gas productions and that inhibition to kind of pursue green tech. How do you balance that with, how do you balance the people who are fearful and the industry that doesn't want to lose business from coal and I guess non-clean energy with actually moving forward with clean energy? I'm not in clean energy. I'm an honors neuroscience student in my undergraduate degree. So I might be a little bit off base here, but I just hear of the big oil companies. Yeah. So how do you combat big oil?
Okay. So a series of questions, and maybe what I'll do is I'll start down at the end and ask if Pat has any comments on any of those questions. We'll work our way back to myself, and then we'll wrap up the session.
Well, I have a sort of a philosophical view on the cost, the carbon tax. I think if the carbon tax keeps increasing, it'll discourage carbon emissions, and it has a natural ceiling, at least for a short period of time, at the cost of direct air capture. So if direct air capture, if I can have my F-150 idling outside so it stays warm, and I pay $700 a ton for that, then I could just have somebody with a direct air capture system take care of those emissions for me, and it might be $600 a ton. So that's a natural economic ceiling and I think that it's going to be really, really hard to translate a complex system of grants, tax incentives, carbon taxes, disincentives. If we have the more complex the system, the more difficult international equity will be. And the more difficult international equity will be, the more trade imbalances will create. So I think that ultimately the end game has to be a carbon tax that's applied among all of the rich nations in the world, if not all nations of the world, and then therefore gets imposed. That's just Pat Carlson thinking long distance philosophically, so I could be completely wrong. And then oil companies are like any company, large or small. They invest money to make money for their shareholders. Some of them have a broader sense of responsibility as well. Like Janet mentioned, our prime directive, where we have 8 stakeholders that we identify that we need to serve. People who are concerned about the environment, the communities where we work, employees, contractors, partners, and governments and regulators, and then finally capital providers. I don't know if I got all 8 there. Pretty close, but we look at all our business decisions with those 8 stakeholders in mind, and that's part of the reason why we're different. But we are not off the hook. We still have to make a profit, so we can only do those things that are profitable today. And so that's how the system works. We have other shareholders or other stakeholders to serve, but we still have to be profitable.
On the carbon price question, the U.S. announced prior to the IRA that they were going to target $100 a ton for CCS by 2030, and that would kind of bring CCS into the kind of the broader application, helping to achieve some of their greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. And like Pat said, I think we need to think about, most broadly, some of these technologies the same way that right now they might be commercially available, but to scale them, we need to kind of set in our own mind what a realistic price might be in order to get that technology sort of fully deployed across different industries. And, the oil and gas industry, I used to work for Shell when we did the Quest project, carbon capture and storage project near Edmonton. And, the company was thinking extremely long term because it's Shell. They've been in business for, 100 plus years. But, smaller type of companies, I think we've got to look for others to carry some of that water. We want to be a part of that effort in scaling these technologies and ultimately driving the cost down. But I think that's, kind of $100 a ton. So in US dollars, about anywhere from $100 to $150 Canadian. I think we'd get a lot of those technologies. But the question you asked was a little bit more complex, because in order to lock in that price and take it to the bank and say, will you give me a loan against this carbon price, someone's got to guarantee that they will pay that to you. And of course, interest rates aren't doing us any favor in the discounting world about what that carbon price, if we lock in that, say, in the year 2030, that the present value of that starts to get less and less today. So it's complex, but I think that that's about the right range. And the question about fear, I don't know. I try every day to combat the fear in the oil and gas industry and in the people I know to say, we do have much. I think we have to do a better job of showing people the opportunity in climate risk management, that there is huge amount of, talking about the technical presentations that we had on the stage today is, really getting people excited about the ability to have whole new industries, jobs, new technical skills in all of the technologies we saw today. And in Canada, we might not always be the leaders, but I think we've demonstrated to date through carbon engineering and a number of companies that we have a huge comparative advantage to play in this game and provide solutions that could be applied globally. So we've got to be able to translate that from fear into that kind of excitement. And I wish I knew that there was a silver bullet solution of how, but I think we're getting there. The younger generation, for sure, is really excited when they hear the story about Queetno, and they want to come work for us just because they hear what we're about. They don't know how hard we have to work, but they say they want to come work for us.
Great. I'll just quickly say on the carbon tax side, I think the $100 per ton is on paper what it would take to do a straightforward carbon capture on an industrial source with storage. To get the direct air capture and things like that, I think you are pushing that $600 to $700 per ton. And I just spent the last week with colleagues in Germany. I don't even think a politician in Germany would get elected proposing a carbon price of $600 to $700 per ton, let alone most places around the world. So I think that's where I see challenges with just the carbon price, encouraging that sort of level of activity. I think the other point about the other transitions you were talking about and activities that happened at a very fast pace. Military ambition, I think in the Second World War, there was a collective agreement about movement, and public was on side with that kind of movement, right? That there was a clear vision. I think with the energy transition, we cannot get on the same page in terms of exactly what path we think we should be taking, and I think that adds the challenge. And then the Apple example is they have a compelling proposition in terms of a different service that you can get from your phone. When we talk about our energy services, we're still delivering kilowatt hours of electricity to your house or to other things. We're not necessarily talking about changing the service that you get or the type of value you get from those. So those are things that I think make this different. Not that we should stop thinking about those, but I do think that that's important. And then I think in terms of attracting talent, I actually don't see that as a problem. I think if you come up with solutions that are exciting, you will draw the young talent to you. And, my engineering students are poised and ready. I think all of them would sign up to work for you. I think that systems thinking approach that we saw with this company is unique, right? I think you have different parts of that being pushed forward with different companies. Thinking about that holistically could offer that kind of solution. And with that kind of solution, you're gonna attract young talent to help push that forward.
Anna, do you want to say something? Okay. Okay, well, we are going to wrap up. I want to take a moment here just to say, we've heard a lot about different technologies. We've heard a lot about different policies. What's clear is that it's not one and one. There's not one thing we can do on the policy front that's going to solve this problem. There's not one technology that's going to take us to where we want to go to. The hopeful piece is that there are a lot of technologies out there that people are exploring. And yes, things are expensive right now. Direct air capture is expensive. Some of the mineralization pathways that we talked about are still slow and therefore costly, but we're making progress all the time. And the same thing with policy. We have a lot of policy solutions in the toolbox now. It's not just carbon pricing. We have low carbon fuel standards that are pushing companies and technologies forward. We have different portfolio standards that can really help in how people choose and utilize different materials. So there's a lot to be hopeful about, even though we face a problem that is of the same sort of magnitude as some of the world wars and some of the huge challenges society has faced in the past. So I hope you take that hope away with you today. I do want to finish up by thanking the organizers of the conference and those for inviting us to be here. I want to thank Queen's University for sponsoring the session, and particularly I'd like to thank Kelly and James, who have been integral parts of this behind the scenes. So thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our panelists for taking time out. You know, they've traveled a long way to be here and taken time out of very busy schedules to take part in this session. I've learned a lot, and I walk away with a sense of hope. I hope that you do too. Please enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your experience. And I'm supposed to say, don't forget to fill out the evaluation survey in the program app. And that's it. Thank you so much.